Modern-day autocrats turn to Sufi movements to justify their tyranny. With an emphasis on the personal and the spiritual, there is a tendency towards political quietism, dismissing the cries of Gaza, condoning normalisation, and delegitimizing struggles for liberation.
To be a Sufi does not necessarily make a person into a quietist, because the evidence points the exact opposite, that they're the ones who brought forth probably the biggest thorn in the side of the colonial project.
I want to talk about Sufism and how potentially it's been politically co-opted. A lot of the authoritarian governments today want the Muslim Ummah to be sedated.
The fact that they had to corner themselves and only latch on to Sufis is actually a proof of Islam, because you couldn't do it to the whole religion.
I spoke to Dr Shadee Elmasry in New York. He argues that historically Sufi movements have been at the fore of fighting for justice. Sufism produced illustrious anti-colonialism struggles and courageous warriors.
In today's world, the biggest frustration to me is that the apparatus that you're fighting against is so massive. You are one little speck in comparison, and you feel that action has become a lot harder. And so therefore, what do we turn to? We turn to relief.
Dr Shadee Elmasry, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's so wonderful to have you with us. Now, today, Dr Shadee, I want to talk about a subject which I think is quite contentious probably in the modern world, and that is the question of Sufism and quietism, and whether there is a connection between some of the quietist movements we see around us, the apolitical movements, maybe even movements that are co-opted by one unsavory government or another, and the ideas and concepts surrounding Sufism.
Yeah.
So I want to take this and understand what Sufism is from its roots, and then inshallah try to sort of understand the historical background of Sufis and Sufi movements, and whether this correlation is a fair correlation to make today. But I suppose let's start with what Sufism is, because there'll be so many of our viewers, many of them non-Muslims even, who may have come across the ideas of Sufism and may just think Sufism is spirituality or having a sort of a spiritual disposition. What is Sufism in your eyes? And do you see it as a movement, as a methodology, or some sort of orientation within Islam? How would you define it?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, first, thanks for having me over, and nice to have you on this side of the ocean, or the pond, as they say. Yes. But right on its off the bat, we have to separate between what they call a had and a rasm. A had, that is the essential common thread that defines something.
Right.
And then a rasm could be a common theme, but is not essential.
Sure.
To give an example, if we were to say a Muslim in London, the rasm, the common conception, would be probably an ethnic background person, right? Most likely, but that's not necessarily the case. There's plenty of white Muslims, yes, British Muslims. So there's only one common thread that goes across the concept of Sufism and Tasawwuf, which is that it is the pursuit of divine love through dhikr and zuhud. Dhikr being remembrance of Allah, very broadly termed. It doesn't have to be the dhikr of a bead, of use of beads. And the zuhud is disentanglement from distractions in your heart. So again, that's very broad, because it may not necessarily be the zuhud of the hands. It may not necessarily be zuhud physically. Uthman ibn Affan, is he not a zahid? But he physically had so much wealth and power around him. Yeah. He couldn't avoid it his whole life. That's the common thread. There is no aqidah common thread across Sufis. Right. Nor fiqh, nor political stance, nor personal temperament. Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, he goes over 200 ways to look at this in definitions, and he said it's sidq at-tawajjuh ilallah, the sincere directedness towards God. That it is a very individual subject. Right. And I think most importantly, I don't have an interest in defending a term or a group, because also terms, words shift and they migrate, and they may be good in one era and they may symbolize something bad in another era. What we care about is the madmoon, or the content. And tasawwuf, at its best, it symbolizes the greatest personal goal that a person can have, which is the pursuit of love of Allah. And Allah speaks about love in the Quran between Him and His ibad and His creation, the human being specifically, in many places. We can't even have to go into it here. But also the Hadith Qudsi speaks about the highest position an individual can have with Allah in the famous hadith called the Hadith al-Tawadu', and can be also called Hadith al-Wilaya, about worshiping Allah privately, personally, individually, until you reach a level that Allah says He loves you. Before that, He loves the obligatory act. The obligatory act is the focus of Allah's love. After doing many supererogatory acts, then the person becomes the recipient of divine love. Before that, he's just the recipient of divine mercy and guidance, but not love. So to attain that is the highest goal of every individual Muslim. And this is something no two Muslims would ever disagree on. And the terms and words are just indicators to that. If we don't like a word, we can all swap it. As they say famously, La mushahata fil istilah. If a word bothers you because of a certain connotation, then we're not here to defend a word that is not directly from the Quran. Humans made up this word, right? The early Muslims made up this word to symbolize these people.
Would you say that someone could achieve those ends, be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, have a love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and for Allah to love him, without necessarily that person subscribing to the modern methodologies of Sufism, for example?
There are two ways we could go about the methodologies. One way is that which is clearly mashru', or clearly dictated in the Sharia and the Sunnah, as the nafilah. Forget the obligations, we're already past that. That's a given. Obligations and prohibitions in that famous hadith of wilaya is a given. But he continues, وَلَا يَزَالُ يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ. He continues to draw near to me with extra good deeds. Yeah. And the nafila has room. There are nafila can be come in different forms, right? So it could come in the form of prayer. Night prayer could come in the form of fasting. It could come in the form of recitation of Quran. If you open up the door of recitation, well, how do you recite it? Right? There's even discussion about this between the scholars on that. So there's so much room for some judgment calls, matters of nafilah that have a judgment call in it, that people can differ on. And then there are things that there's no difference upon.
Today I want to talk about Sufism and how potentially it's been politically co-opted. But I'm fascinated in just this base conversation about what Sufism is and what it isn't. Often, especially amongst non-Muslims who develop this sort of trend to become closer to the spirit or spirituality, they would often sort of hold on to Sufism as a means by which they can become closer to the spiritual, to the divine. The conversation we just had implies that there is a deep interconnection between loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for Allah to love you, and the pursuit of following the shariah by the obligations and the nawafil actions. How important is the shariah to this sort of scheme of gaining closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Well, the Sufism became popular in the West in the 60s and 70s, right, through Americans and British people who had been pre-influenced by Christianity and its monasticism, by their delving into Buddhism and Hinduism. So when they came upon that strand in Islam, I think they superimposed that on top of it. Okay. And that's why the initial introduction of Sufism into the West, it was a Hindu, Buddhist, Christian slanted spirituality that you actually don't necessarily find in Islam. Historically, you don't find it in Islam.
Over 3,000 years ago, Musa alayhi salam and his people stood trapped, oppressed, afraid, with nowhere to run. But then, Allah split the sea. It wasn't just water that moved. It was fear, suffering, and despair, giving way to freedom, dignity, and a new beginning. Today, countless families face their own impossible seas. Conflict, hunger, displacement. They wait for a way out, for a path forward. And just like then, a way can open now. With your charity, with your compassion, you can be the reason hope is born again. On this day of Ashura, honor the spirit of hope. Give today. Turn your compassion into hope.
Spell that out for me. Like we have lots of non-Muslim viewers who may be surprised to hear that there is a Islam is not sort of monastic type of faith. Like explain practically how that is.
So yes, Tasawwuf and the Sufi way seeks to move away from distractions from Allah, but there's a limit to that.
Right.
So we don't hold monasticism to be favorable. If you happen not to be married, that's fine. But to believe in monasticism, you're actually doing an innovation. You're believing something is better than what the Prophet did, right? Alayhi salatu wassalam. Or, for example, vows of poverty. So could that possibly be someone's expression? Yes, it could be, but it is not intentionally elevated. You will not find anywhere in the Shariah that the Prophet, peace be upon him, called or recommended, or any of the major Sufi shuyukh recommended you to disavow of all your wealth, for example. For example, priests, they have no wealth. Everything they own is the church. Their shirt is the church, is the car is the church. I don't even know if they have bank accounts, right? So no husband, no wife, no wealth, and no engagement in anything. It's just not our way. And anyone who you were to interact just briefly look at history, you'll find that's not the case. Right. And that's what I mean by they seem to have a filter. And then maybe that's what they were looking for. Once you have a filter, that's what you start looking for. But if you go back in the history, as I said, there is no common thread in the word or phrase of tasawwuf or the people who attribute themselves to this, except for the concept of seeking the love of Allah through dhikr and zuhud. Or you could say zuhud first and dhikr second. There is no aqidah to tasawwuf. Right. And there is, I will tell you, a fiqhi slant that the Sufiya will have. They will have a slant in fiqh, but their madhahib, there is no fiqhi madhab called the madhab of the Sufis, for example. Sure. There's just a slant, which I'll bring up later.
Yeah. Okay. So Sufis can be, Hanafi or Shafi'i or Maliki. This is not a school of thought. It's a way of living and thinking.
In today's world, it's a rasm that Sufis, for example, are Ash'aris.
Okay.
But historically, there is no such limit. In fact, the greatest of Sufiya are two. Mm-hmm. One in his works, and the other in his heritage, right. His silsila. And one came before the other. The first is the greatest author in tasawwuf. He's a mutakallim. He's a kalam scholar in aqidah. And we all know that is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali.
Yes.
After he passed away, in Iraq came the greatest founder of an order. And he didn't even found it himself. He was just naturally being himself as a sheikh. And later on, his followers made it an order. And that is the biggest tariqah in the world, which is Al-Qadiriyah. And he's an Athari. He was asked about ilm al-kalam, and he told his disciple, it doesn't benefit you in your grave. Laysa min zad al-qabr. So they say, how could we love him, we love Ghazali, how can we bring the two together? He's saying half of Ghazali's work in ilm al-kalam was useless. He said, yeah, because Ghazali had already cleaned up shop in Baghdad and destroyed all these batinis. So at the time, there was no need for this, right? So he was correct in what he did, and he was correct in what he did, because their context differed. I'll give you Sheikh al-Harawi, translated by our very own Dr. Hatem al-Hajj from the great state of New Jersey here.
Yes.
And Sheikh al-Harawi, he was an Athari. And we have here Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Wasiti, Miftah al-Tariq, al-Hanbali, wal-Athari, translated by our very own John Starling from the great state of New Jersey. And then we have here from the Kalam scholars, or the Ash'ara, who is ala tariqat al-muhaddithin, which means his writing was like the hadith scholars. Imam al-Nawawi, okay, Shafi'i, who has a chapter in his Maqasid on the place of tasawwuf, or the parameters of tasawwuf, in his book Al-Maqasid. And we have from the Sufiya who had no stance in Aqidah, such as Uwais al-Qarni. No stance at all. He didn't expose himself to the subject. And we had those Sufiya who had their own stance in Aqidah, neither Athari nor Kalami. Ibn Arabi, who brought his own view to things. And then you have Sufiya regarding jurisprudence. Regarding jurisprudence, you had those who were not fuqaha. They were not jurists, like Fudayl ibn Iyad. You don't see Fudayl ibn Iyad ever speaking as a jurist. Then you have those who were jurists, such as Ahmad Zarruq, who followed a madhab. Then you have the jurist who was a mujtahid on his own, Sufyan al-Thawri. He did not follow anyone. He was a mujtahid mutlaq. He could have formed one of the four madhabs. Could have been his. You have Sufis who preached and Sufis who didn't preach. For example, Shaqiq al-Balkhi, from the early ones, he didn't preach. But another one was Junayd al-Sadiq, and he was an imam. So you had those who were completely solitary too. Ibrahim ibn Adham, contrasted with Junayd al-Sadiq, who was the leader of his people. Sayyid al-Ta'ifa, he's called. And he's the one who monitored all of them to make sure that they're following the spiritual path properly. And you had those who founded spiritual paths and those who didn't. For example, Abu al-Hasan al-Shadili. He has a tariqah, just like someone who founds a madhab. And you had those who did not. Neither they followed one, nor did they found one. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. You can't find which tariqah he was part of. He was no part of any tariqah. Nor did he found a tariqah. You cannot look around and say, where's the tariqah al-Ghazaliyah so I could follow it. He has his books and that's it. And then you have those who followed but didn't found one, such as Zarruq. So all of this is, I'm trying to present that there's only one common thread. Yeah. And it is not limited to any madhab, methodology, or fiqh, or aqidah.
I think that's really clear. And that's a fascinating way into understanding Sufism. So we're embarking on this conversation about Sufism and why it sometimes is synonymous with this quietism. Historically, this is before the modern period where people imprinted their own sort of understanding of what it means to be spiritual onto Islam and onto Sufism. Historically, can we say that Sufis were more inclined towards being quietists? So what I mean by quietists, I suppose, is if they saw an error in their society or within their elites, they were inclined to leave that for the sake of closeness to God. Is there a history there, a pedigree there of Sufism and quietism?
The original Sufis, they came in a time where they viewed that the world and the ummah was in fact taken care of. That there was no need for them to try to become judges, governors, but that does not mean they didn't contribute. Right. They were people who for one circumstance or another, out of a conviction or just circumstance, tended to live more alone and away from the people. Okay. And that is because they felt the society had become corrupted. namely not corrupted with sinfulness only, but excess. It was excessive. Things were getting excessive. So if you read in the book Al-Risala al-Qushayriya, the epistle of al-Qushayri, it's a PDF online, you can get it. And you read, he gives you the biographies. Almost across the board, these are people who felt the society has become so materialistic. And yes, whatever problems there are people handling it. And we feel that we'd be safer in our religion if we're to live alone. And so some of them never settle in their whole life. They never settle for their entire lives. And if they become known, they leave. They don't want fame. They don't want attachments. So that is the origin of it. But it is not the rule. But it's the origin. Now, some of them did that while signing up for the army, such as Uwais al-Qarni. Uwais al-Qarni, why is he special? Because he's from the second generation, never met the Prophet ﷺ. But by means of revelation, the Prophet knew about him. And he praised him. So we know that he's in the middle category between a regular person and a companion. And Allah put that there for a wisdom. Because he's not a regular person, because the Prophet praised him. Therefore, the Prophet has checked off on him. What he's doing is good. But why Allah did not make him a companion? Because that's not the sunnah. It's an exception. If your circumstance allows for this, then you could live like Uwais al-Qarni. But you don't try to live like Uwais al-Qarni. That's the difference. He fought in battles. So we don't have a concept of quietism to say that I'm going to leave off society and let it go to hell if it wants to go to hell and let it be good if it wants to be good. That's not allowed. But we can say, I'm not going to put my nose into things that are not my business. Right. If it comes to me, I'll deal with it. If the ruler calls for it, I'll accept the call. So that's, I would say, a middle category between someone who's sticking his nose in society and someone washing his hands clean from society.
Okay, I think that's interesting. So when we think about a lot of the authoritarian, let's say, governments today, or governments that want the Muslim Ummah to be sedated and would like to offer to the Muslim Ummah a very pacifist type of Islam. And I don't mean an Islam which is the opposite of that, an Islam which is violent, but I just mean an Islam that doesn't care and is neutral about the big issues of our time, Gaza or wherever it may be. Often, I think it's fair to say that they do latch on to Sufism as an idea, corrupted or not, or subverted or not, but Sufism as an idea, as a way to sort of pacify the masses and say, look, that's your business and our business is different. And we're in the business of statecraft and cunningness and politics. But if you want to be good Muslims, then you should pursue this spiritual path. We do see that today. I mean, how would you explain how quickly they latch on to Sufism as a way to sort of pacify people?
Well, I think that's a strength to Islam, because when they wanted to do that to Christianity, they did it to the whole religion. But they can't do it to the whole religion of Islam because it's that crystal clear. But the maximum they could do it to was to one personalized strand within Islam. Yeah. So that's actually, the fact that they had to corner themselves and only latch on to Sufis for that is actually a proof of Islam, because you couldn't do it to the whole religion because the whole religion is that clear. And that pacifism, yes, it's possible, and it is possible Sufis are humans, right? So they could be the corrupt ones amongst them. There could be misguided ones. And there have been collaborators. In every colonized nation, there have to be collaborators. The collaborators are going to come from the people, right? Whoever the leaders of the people are that are soft-minded, whether they're Sufis or not. I mean, today, you could probably have collaborators with governments who are not Sufis. That's because there are no Sufis to be had that have any power. So there's almost no point, but in certain countries at least. But historically, this isn't the case. Historically, the the ire of the colonizers was against the Sufis, because they're the ones, if I can share you with this list,
Please.
that they're the ones who brought forth probably the biggest thorn in the side of the colonial project. Right. And the reason is that at that point in Islamic society, to have a Sufi teaching, this was just a default, right? It was a default setting across the Islamic world, maybe due to whatever factors, but it was a default setting that you were involved in some way in some self-purification teaching, or silsila, as they call it, a chain, connected chain. So let's take an example. Who are the people who fought in the 1800s in Morocco against the Portuguese? They were the Shadee. And it was a group called the Shurafa As-Saadiyya. And this was a class of society. They were the political class, and they were sharifs from Ahl al-Bayt. And they were Shadee, right? By just their description. That was their tariqah. In the 1800s, shortly thereafter, local paganism, local pagans in the Nigeria area, what the Arabs call it Sudan. The whole area, they call it Sudan. The Hausaland strip, led by Uthman Dan Fodio, who was a Qadiri. And he was a Hassani from Ahl al-Bayt. Right. And he was also descended from Uqba bin Nafi'. There's two noble descents in North Africa, which is to be descendant from the original Sahabi who came, that was Uqba ibn Nafi', and then of course to be descendant from Al-Hasan ibn Ali, and he was descendant of both. He is one of the most amazing ones. Maybe we could zoom in on him later. In 1825, Abdurrahman al-Jabarti was a Khalwati sheikh and a historian, and we get most of our history of the French entering upon Egypt from al-Jabarti. He was a Khalwati, and he كان يحث على الجهاد. In 1831, Ahmed Bareli in Punjab, he fought the Sikhs, and he was a Naqshbandi, and he died in 1831. In the 1830s, Prince Diponegoro was a Qadiri in Java, in Indonesia, and he fought the Dutch. In the 1860s, there was a huge movement to fight back the British by Haji Shari'atullah, and his entire philosophy was called the Faraizi movement, which is basically reviving the fara'id. It's like, we're not pious anymore. And he had no tariqah at all. It was just Sufi inspired. In 1857, of course, one of the biggest Naqshbandi scholars, Fadl al-Haq, announced that this was a jihad against the British. In 1860s and 70s and before that, in the Caucasus Mountains, the enemy were the Russians, and the leader against them was Imam Shaman, Naqshbandi he was, as Fazl al-Haq was. In China, fighting the Qing dynasty was Ma Hualong, and he was a Naqshbandi sheikh who started a jihad. We're talking physical jihads. We're not talking about jihad of the nafs. In 1883, in Algeria, of course, the well-known Emir Abdel Qadir fought the French, and he was a Qadri. In 1885, in Sudan, marked the end of the Mahdi movement. And he was a Khalwati, Sammani Khalwati sheikh, who fought the British in Sudan in the famous Battle of Durman, which he led. Shortly thereafter that, or simultaneously really, is Omar Mukhtar. Omar Mukhtar was a Sanusi, and the Sanusi are, I believe, a branch of the Qadiriyya, if I'm not mistaken. The Sanusi fought the Italians. In 1935, one of the first people to fight the British Mandate and to fight the newly coming Zionists. Why do they call it the Qassam Brigade? Because of Izzuddin Qassam, who was an Azhari trained Qadiri scholar. In the 1980s, who did most of the heavy lifting against the Soviets? The local people, who were Naqshbandis and Qadiris, and their shuyukh were all Naqshbandi, Hanafi trained scholars. So you see here that to be a Sufi is not going to necessarily make a person into a quietist, because the evidence points the exact opposite. You are going to be what you are based on your knowledge, your taqwa, right? and whatever's your imams are influencing you at that time, because again, there is no common thread across Sufism that would cause a person to be a quietist. In fact, I would think it's the opposite.
Yeah, expand on that. So that's really interesting, because these are this illustrious sort of anti-colonialist individuals. These sheikhs, these fighters are all Sufis. Is there something within Sufism, a reserve that they're drawing upon to fight the imperialists?
Yeah, well, to be total, to look at it completely fairly, these shuyukh, these men, these warriors, they did not go into battle because their book of Sufism said so. They went into battle because the Sharia said so.
Right.
Sufism is supposed to give life to the Sharia.
Sure.
Right? Just to make it totally clear, this is a rasm. They happen to be Sufis, right? But you don't have this many people, except that Sufism clearly does give life to the Sharia. And the way it gives life to the Sharia is by making us love what comes after death. Famous story of Ibrahim alayhi salam mentioned in Ihya Ulumuddin. The angel of death comes to him to take his life. He looks to the heavens and he says, "Oh Allah, does a Khalil take the life of another Khalil?" Then the angel of death goes away. And then he comes back and he says, "A message from your Khalil." He says, "Does not a Khalil want to meet his Khalil?" So when Sufism teaches these things, that it's against trying to prolong this worldly life, it seeks to put you out of the comforts of this worldly life. That's what allows you to give life to the Sharia and to go into it without hesitation.
That's fantastic, right? So there is this strong connection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and a strong connection with the afterlife that makes one inclined towards returning to Allah, His beloved, and that surely should be a strength for someone who's fighting imperialism and fighting and resisting.
And by the way, because to be fair about this, you can have the same teaching without ever picking up a book that said Sufism on it.
That's interesting.
This is just hadiths.
Yeah.
This is just understanding. So what Sufism does is it tries to extrapolate the hadith that will make you turn away from the comforts of this world and towards the love of Allah through remembrance, ibadah, and devotion. That is what the subject's all about. Just like the subject of in Iman, Islam, Iman, Ihsan. Subject of Islam is the rules. So the fuqaha will extract what they call ayat al-ahkam, ahadith al-ahkam. Those, he will look at the Quran looking for rulings, contracts, how to live, how to marry, how to pray, etc. In theology, Islam, Iman. Iman is theology. The theology is looking for verses and hadiths that are telling us what to believe. And Ihsan is looking at the verses and hadith that tell us how to be excellent. And excellent here means, izhad fi dunya yuhibbuk Allah. Leave off this world, Allah will love you. So again, it's these two pillars. You're seeking divine love through zuhud and through dhikr. Right? And so does it have a positive impact? Clearly it has a positive impact. But, and we also have to say that this positive impact, it could be, it is gleaned. It's the same material, whether you call it Sufism or not. Let's say I'm going to come up in a time where the Sufis are all traitors and I hate them. I physically hate them. And there are so many people who physically, they will get nauseous at the notion of Sufis because the way they grew up, these are the traitors. That's an accident in history. In their piece, little sliver of history, and that could be in Dagestan, that could be in Cairo, that could be, they were traitors. These people are traitors. They're not doing dawah, they're not teaching Quran, they're not teaching tajweed. I don't know what they're doing. And people will testify to that. They'll tell you that. That's their view of it. So in that case, they physically get nauseous when they hear the word. It doesn't make a difference. Cross out the word, right? When you seek to draw near to Allah, it's the same verses and hadiths, right? It ends up being, that's why I said earlier, it's never worth it to argue for a word. It's the madmoon, right? It's the content that matters.
Sheikh Shadee, you've listed a number of these illustrious individuals who fought colonialism, fought imperialism, and they belong to, in some shape or form, to this broad spectrum of understanding that we call Sufism. I sort of feel a little dissatisfied in a way to move on unless we delve into a little bit more of their lives. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about some of these individuals? I don't know, Uthman Dan Fodio or Omar Mukhtar, the Lion of the Desert, or
Uthman Dan Fodio is one of my favorites. Uthman Dan Fodio, he came at a time where the Hausa-land had a lot of conflict, and the vying for power caused many Muslims to make alliances with pagans, and over time to soften to pagan ways. And so the scene became very sloppy. And he had a sheikh named Jibril, Sheikh Jibril. It's his number one inspiration. And he said, we need a whole new revival. We need tajdeed. We need to do this whole thing from scratch. At that time, these were Malikis and Ash'ari Qadiris. That was the curriculum.
I'm right in saying this is modern day Nigeria.
Yeah, we're talking here, Uthman Dan Fodio died in 1817. Oh. So we're talking late 1700s into the 1800s. Yeah. And mid 1700s. So he trains this student. He trains Uthman. And Uthman becomes an alim himself. But he becomes an amazing da'i. And he starts teaching. And he goes and he gives speeches. But his method of teaching was that he had reached really the highest levels of scholarship, so he could teach a scholar from scratch and produce a scholar. But he also had wisdom. And he used to say that the book of the common man is the song. So he used to write the teaching in the native Hausa language, and he used to give it his own melodies. And he used to do it in such a simple way that they could memorize these, a couple lines and just sing it as a song. And he started having gatherings for the common people that involved recitation of Quran and dhikr and singing these songs. And these songs would get stuck in people's heads. And as they say, that people in the marketplace would be singing songs that had in it aqidah, right? Because that's how the common person learns. So he was able to tap into the elite and the common. And this continued to spread to the point that he was once invited to one of the king's palaces, and he went and he invited him to Islam and gave him some talk, etc. And he left, and the king loved him. So everything was good, and people started to flock to him. That king died, and his son came in, and immediately he called for the meeting. He took a pistol out, tried to shoot him. But it backfired, and he burnt himself. So the people there took it as like, this is the future. In the future, he's going to destroy you. Just like Moses almost, how the Pharaoh, young Musa took the crown right off his head, put it on his head when Musa was a baby. So the people there took it as an ishara. There's going to be conflict here. Obviously, there's going to be conflict. He just tried to shoot you, but you're going to win the conflict. And so that initiated a period of hijrah. He had to take his people, and back in the day, there weren't clear lines of where people lived. You could just move to an empty patch of desert. So his group is growing, and it's called the Jama'ah. That's what they call his group. And everyone there, to be a leader, you have to learn fiqh. You cannot be a leader without knowing tajweed and fiqh. And so he was very strict on the side of knowledge. It wasn't just that he was seeking a general direction towards Islam. No, you needed to know your stuff. And he had some manuals that he wanted everyone in the Jama'ah to know. And he was actually criticized by these wayward, semi-Muslim, even pagans, because at that time, they didn't let the women leave. But he was like, no, the women got to study. And he would bring them out to the masajid to study, right? And that was that was one way they said he's an immoral man, because he's bringing the women out to study into the masajid. But the next phase really symbolized the Battle of Badr for them, because they were attacked with a big attack, and somehow they won. So they considered that, he said, that's our Battle of Badr. The next wave came out that their youth were overzealous, wanted to go out and fight the next battle. They lost. So they said, that's our Uhud. His life resembles the Prophet so much you can't imagine. Then his enemies weakened. He got stronger. He established a khilafah. And they called it the Sokoto Caliphate. Sokoto is still a city now that's one of the greatest cities of Islam in Nigeria. Yes. Now, interestingly, though, he didn't himself do the ruling. He had his brother and his son ruled east and west, and he was in the masjid ensuring that the spirit, the purpose of this khilafah was continuing, which was al-ilm wal-ibadah. He emphasized that you have to have knowledge, but you also have to be worshipful. And I remember someone saying in the Afghan war that one of the things that the Afghans would say regarding the Russians, that we have victory by ibadah. The more ibadah we do, devotion to Allah Ta'ala that we do, the more miracles occur. And the Afghan war, it's all miracles. These are people who with flip-flops and surface-to-air missiles. The guy has never picked up anything like this before in his life. They're literally reading the manual as they try to use it. And before they even figure out how to, you know, it's like lighting a wick, like the old cartoon bombs. Before they even figure it out, the Russians are fleeing. I mean, so many stories like that. So Uthman Dan Fodio believed in the same thing. It's by taqwa that you get Allah's help. So he stayed in the masjid, proverbially speaking. He went around making sure that the ibadah and the ilm was sound and that the hearts of the people were alive. And he left his brother and his son to rule. And eventually he completely resigned all position because of his old age, and he passed away. But he's somebody who had great success. But not everyone else had great success. Keep in mind, all this list shows that the fruit of the tree was clean. It was good. Just the fact they resisted. They didn't have to win. Al-Hussein resisted where the resistance was appropriate and was the best thing to do. People say, oh, how could he rebel? Because he's a mujtahid. He's a mujtahid imam, right? And he give the fatwa where, no, this is not the time to obey. These are not the rulers the Prophet said to follow and obey. He's a mujtahid imam. People forget this. And as the certain groups say, he's killed by the lawfully killed as a rebel. This is like a crazy statement to make. But you go to another one, such as Imam Shamil, was a sadder story. He fought a lot and ultimately was just totally overpowered. Yet Allah honored him by having him, basically, even when the Russians captured him, they honored him. They put him in a castle. He lived in a castle under house arrest. Eventually he got permission to make Umrah and Hajj, and he dies in Medina. He's buried in Al-Baqiyah, Imam Shamil. He's buried in Baqiyah. One of his young people that he met there was Imam Amir Abdul Qadir, who met Imam Shamil. You wonder what kind of conversation that was, because maybe they don't realize they're two legends that we're going to be talking about later on. He was Imam Abdul Qadir. Amir Abdul Qadir was young. Imam Shamil was in his last years, and they met at Hajj. And Hajj always was a place of meeting for scholars. Amir Abdul Qadir fought, and he established himself a state too. Established himself for a period of time, a state. So again, it's not Sufism, tasawwuf, that says go and do this. It's tasawwuf that gives life to the whole shariah. That's the whole purpose of tasawwuf, is to ihya ulum ad-din. It's not a law unto itself. No, it's what gives life to your practice of the law. And that person, right, if he's a healthy vessel and he understands the message properly, then it gives life to the sharia. And he does the right thing. And where the vessel is unclean, if tasawwuf doesn't clean it out, then nothing will. Because the whole purpose of tasawwuf is to cleanse this vessel out. So if you're corrupt despite these teachings, then who knows then what's going to fix that person.
I mean, from what you've described there, there's also an environment, a climate where these amazing personalities are being produced, and that climate is a society, a community that loves Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and wants Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessing and barakah in everything they do. Can I fast forward to today? Because, Gaza has inspired, subhanAllah, many young people in particular to get involved sometimes for the first time in activism and to be politically more motivated, whether that's, boycotting or demonstrations or protests or other forms of actions and activities. How important is this spiritual side to completing that activism?
This spirituality is what purifies your intent, and it strengthens your motivation, and it cuts and breaks the chains of loving this world that causes a people not to take action. And today's world is a bit different. People don't want to hear talk. I mean, talk is, for us, teachings are important. Religious teachings are important, but it's actions is what matters. And ultimately, what I hate is the way that we're really trapped by modern societies. The realm of action is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. In our world, people are surveilled. People are worried for their jobs. The apparatus that you're fighting against is so massive. How are you actually going to physically fight? That's even more important than surveillance and anything else. Like, okay, what are you going to do? Back in the old days, if you looked at what the greats did, he took a bunch of people. Let's go live on our own, build up our ranks, build up our morale. The Ottomans started that way. He took a group of people and said, let's live on our own. And you could do that in the past, find a patch of land. In today's world, the biggest frustration to me is that the apparatus that you're fighting against is so massive. You are one little speck in comparison, and you feel that action has become a lot harder. And so therefore, what do we turn to? We turn to relief. We can give relief at least, or at least we could try to speak the truth if you can. But that's one of the frustrating things to me, because action is really what matters. And words, they're easy. And sometimes they're not. If we were in Egypt, if we were in the Emirates, if we were in Saudi, the first thing someone would say is, we got to know the topic you're going to talk about, because we got families, we got jobs, we got a life that's going to be taken away. Some of these people are so vicious, they don't come after you, they'll come after your family. Right? So they know how to silence people.
That's true. But how different is that from the past, from the 18th, 19th century, from the period that you're talking about, where these people, were battling imperialists who used twisted means sometimes, who used these indirect means to harm them and their families. Mm-hmm. I suppose your argument here, your point is that if one has a strong, intimate connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one then is able to battle some of these inhibitions within one's soul that prevents them from being active and from conducting the right behaviors. So in a sense, I think the need to be close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is paramount today in anyone who's engaged in activism. I mean, I think that's probably your point, right?
That's the point, because there's going to be so many ups and downs.
Yeah.
There's going to be so many failures. There's going to be so many walls. If you're doing anything that is in any way pleasing to Allah, then it's angering to shaitan. Yeah. You're going to have a shaitan as your enemy. You're going to have many shaitans as your enemy. If you're doing something that is not pleasing to God, shaitan is not going to be against you. If you're doing something that is, you're going to have humans and you're going to have demons fighting you. And they don't just fight you in your cause. They could disrupt your life in other ways. Initiate a divorce, initiate whatever, initiate fitna between you and your brothers. And that's one of the tricks of Iblis that shaitan is using against people today as they're turning closer to Islam. The Prophet ﷺ said, Inna shaytana ya'isa an ya'budahu al-musalluna fi jazirat al-Arab. Shaitan, he's despaired that to be worshipped by the praying people in the Arabian Peninsula, meaning the religious Muslims. Meaning they're not going to go and completely alter the religion and fall into idolatry. وَلَكِنْ التَّحْرِيشِ بَيْنَهُم. However, what he does have hope in is to sow argumentation amongst them. And when you look at what some of the things that happened here, Emir Abdul Qadir, he had to face some munafiqs from Morocco, a ruler from Morocco who agreed with the French to try to assassinate Emir Abdul Qadir. So sowing discord amongst us, this is an unseen thing that Shaitan is doing. So if you're a group fighting for something good, if you're an individual fighting for something good, you're going to have Shaitan to fight against too. And you have to know these tricks, and you have to know how to repel him. He pushes people until they go too far, right? There have been people who said they want to go in and do something physically. I'd had to say to them, okay, look, listen, we have a parameter in our religion. We have parameters here, right? There are certain things we can't do. Just because you want it in the name of doing something, I get the sentiment, but you do have a religion. So there's Shaitan pushing someone over the top to do something we're not allowed to do in Islam. So point being is that the need for spirituality in action is as the need of life to the body. There's no difference. You need health. You need life. You need energy. You need motivation. And that's what spirituality is to action.
One final question for you, Dr. Shadee. How can young Muslims today who want to re-engage with the breadth of Islamic culture, Islamic understanding, and part of that is to connect intimately with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what advice would you give to a young Muslim who wants to do that, but wants to be active and wants to make a change for this ummah? What advice would you give them so that they don't fall prey to a type of Sufism that pacifies them and that makes them unconcerned about the plight of our ummah?
I actually worry about that a lot less than the opposite, than someone who wants to act without neither knowledge or self-purification. Everyone today wants to act. I would say that's a good thing, that actions speak louder than words. And it's frustrating today, right now. We're all frustrated that there's very little action, actual concrete changes. You're handcuffed, it seems. Actual concrete changes. I'm not talking like putting up a clever meme or whatever. No, which is, according to Sami Hamdi, I knew you've interviewed him a couple times, he did talk about how that changed the world, right? So we can't say that that's not nothing either. But when you see what's happening in Gaza and you realize, like, there's not even an army that I could say, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell the U.S. government, thank you very much. I'm going to have to renounce my citizenship, and I'm joining this country and I'm joining this army. Because that's the legal way to do it. I mean, certain countries you can't fight for or against and be a citizen at the same time, right? So as someone said, I want to go do something, I said, look, do it lawfully, because in Islam, we're bound by the law. You're going to go and renounce your citizenship, then do what you want to do after that. But that's the way it would actually occur if we even had a country. And we don't even have a nation right now that you could say, okay, that's the country that's fighting for the truth, right? And I'm going to go with them. Can't do, there's nothing. So it's extremely frustrating. But it's, I think, a harder sell, but more important, to tell people when you want to take action, you need to act according. You're not going to change the world. It's Allah who changes things. And if you want to be part of that, you need to do it in His way. So you have to learn the Sharia, and you have to purify your intention, and you have to act as a Sharia would want us to act. And that's probably the harder sell, and the more important sell when people want to act and they want to do something and be active.
Dr. Shadee Elmasry, the Adhan for Maghrib is going now. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time.
Wa iyaakum, my pleasure. Jazakallah khair.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.